major cult killing in history shared one thing in common, and it was never the leader. It was the followers. Ordinary people, teachers, parents, college graduates, people who had jobs, families, and futures. What happened inside their minds that made them abandon everything they knew, and in the most extreme cases, cross lines that most human beings could never imagine crossing? That is the question that investigators, psychologists, and lawmakers have been trying to answer for decades. And the answer is far more unsettling than the crimes themselves. Nobody joins a cult. That is one of the most important things psychologists who study these groups want you to understand. Nobody wakes up one morning, decides to abandon their identity, and hand control of their life to a stranger. They join a community. They join a family. They join a sense of purpose they didn't have before. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, a series of groups emerged that would change how law enforcement, the courts, and society itself understood the relationship between psychological influence and criminal responsibility. These were groups with structured belief systems, charismatic central figures, and at their core, a deliberate process of identity replacement. Dr. Robert Lifton, a Harvard psychiatrist who spent decades studying authoritarian thought control, identified 8 criteria present in nearly every high-control group. Among them, the control of information, the demand for purity, and what he called loading the language, where ordinary words are replaced with group-specific terms that slowly erode a member's ability to think critically from the outside. And the research showed something that shocked even experienced investigators. The more educated a person was, the more susceptible they could be, because they were confident in their ability to evaluate information. That confidence became a vulnerability. The most sophisticated aspect of high-control groups is not what they demand of their members. It is what they offer. They offer answers. Certainty, a structured world in which every question has a response, every doubt has an explanation, and every fear has a remedy. For people going through life transitions, a divorce, a career loss, a death in the family, this is deeply appealing. In the documented history of destructive cults, investigators have identified a consistent 3-stage onboarding process. First, love bombing, in which new members are overwhelmed with attention, praise, and a sense that they have found their true community. Second, information control, where outside sources, family, media, former friends, are gradually framed as threats or negative influences. Third, incremental commitment escalation, where each small decision made inside the group makes the next larger decision feel more natural. Psychologists call this the foot-in-the-door technique at a systematic scale. By the time members realize the group's demands have become extreme, they have already surrendered their outside relationships, their financial independence, and in many cases, their sense of self. Social psychologist Dr. Leon Festinger called this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding 2 conflicting beliefs, and he found that people will change their perception of reality rather than accept that a major investment was a mistake. They never see it coming. And that is exactly how it is designed. There is a critical psychological threshold that researchers call the point of no return. The moment when an individual's belief system has been so thoroughly reconstructed that actions they would have once found unthinkable become justifiable within their new framework. It is not a sudden shift. Documented case reviews, post-incident psychological evaluations, and survivor testimonies all confirm the same pattern. The shift is gradual, incremental, and masked by the group's internal language. In the documented history of cult-related criminal events, investigators consistently found that participants did not perceive themselves as committing crimes. They perceived themselves as fulfilling a mission, protecting their community, or following a divine directive, from someone they had been conditioned to trust unconditionally. This psychological state, sometimes called ethical bypassing by modern researchers, explains what law enforcement officials described as otherwise rational behavior in interview after interview with former members who had committed or witnessed serious offenses. Former FBI behavioral analyst Robert Hare noted that high-control group leaders frequently demonstrate measurable psychopathic traits. Specifically, a clinical lack of empathy combined with exceptional charisma and social intelligence. This combination creates what he described as a perfect predator-prey psychological dynamic. The followers are not weak, they are human, and that distinction is what drove decades of legal debate. When law enforcement agencies first began investigating cult-related criminal cases at scale in the 1970s and 80s, they encountered a problem they had not been trained for. The evidence gathered at scenes was straightforward. Witness statements were available. Participants in many cases had not tried to conceal their actions, but the criminal framework they were working within, designed to prosecute individuals who made voluntary, informed decisions to commit crimes, had no clear language for people who had been psychologically conditioned over years to comply with directives they had lost the independent will to refuse. Federal investigators who reviewed the aftermath of several major cult incidents in the late 20th century noted a consistent gap. The existing law treated coercion as physical, a threat, a weapon, a direct order under duress. But psychological coercion, the slow, sustained dismantling of a person's identity and decision-making capacity. And what investigators found next changed everything. In reviewing communications, journals, and recorded internal group meetings, federal analysts discovered a consistent pattern that they had only previously associated with totalitarian state systems. Systematic documentation of members' personal vulnerabilities, extracted during private counseling sessions and retained as leverage. A practice scholars would later call confessional blackmail. This evidence reshaped not only the prosecutions that followed, but the entire academic and legal field of coercive control. Here is the part of this story that most people have never heard. In the wake of the major cult investigations of the late 20th century, several law enforcement agencies compiled what became known internally as retention dossiers. These were detailed personal files compiled by group leadership on every member, containing private disclosures made during mandatory group counseling sessions. These sessions were positioned as spiritual or psychological healing. Members were encouraged to reveal their deepest fears, past traumas, and personal secrets, all of which were transcribed and stored, not for therapeutic purposes. Nobody wanted to talk about this, because acknowledging the existence of these systems raised an uncomfortable legal question. If members had been subjected to ongoing blackmail and psychological leverage derived from coerced disclosures, could their subsequent actions be considered fully voluntary? Legal scholars debated this for years. Several jurisdictions quietly began revising their definitions of coercion. But the deeper question, one that still divides legal theorists today, was whether the criminal justice system could ever adequately address crimes where the weapon used was not physical, but psychological. Former members who testified in subsequent trials described it this way. They were not afraid of what would happen if they disobeyed. They had been conditioned to be afraid of who they would become. That is a category of control that no law had ever been written to address. Not just what did they do, but how did they get there? And what systems, social, institutional, legal, failed to stop it before it began? Because the most effective answer to the psychology of cult violence is not found in a courtroom. It is found in education, in community, in the quiet vigilance of recognizing the patterns early enough to matter. If this documentary gave you a new lens through which to understand one of society's most misunderstood phenomena, that is where the work begins.